What if I told you that one of the most famous, heart-wrenching Japanese poems ever written about grief was just a complete and utter lie?
Oh, you mean the comb poem?
Exactly. Picture
Yeah.
this. A man is standing in a cold, dark bedroom, and it's autumn. He takes a step, and under his foot, he hears this sharp snap of a comb.
His dead wife's comb.
Right, it's his dead wife's comb. The chill of the room, the sudden crushing weight of the loss, I mean, it is just visceral. You can feel the exact moment his heart breaks.
Yeah. The imagery in that poem is undeniably powerful. I mean, it is a celebrated masterpiece by the 18th century poet Busan, but there is a rather massive historical problem with how we read it today.
Which is just wild to me.
Right, because when Busan wrote that deeply moving, supposedly spontaneous observation of grief, his wife was doing just fine.
Wait, really?
Yeah, she was very much alive. In fact, she ended up outliving him by like 31 years.
I couldn't believe that when I read it in our sources. He's essentially just sitting in his study, completely fabricating this tragic, deeply personal scenario out of thin air.
Completely made up.
And the reason this is so shocking to me, and I am sure to you listening, is because it shatters everything we are usually taught about this art form. We're told haiku has to be a literal snapshot.
Right, a direct observation.
Yeah, like a spontaneous Zen-like observation of a real moment in nature, completely free of fiction or metaphor.
But that concept of the pure, literal haiku moment is a modern myth. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of how classical Japanese poetry actually functioned. To truly understand what Busan and other masters were doing, we have to strip away centuries of projected Western assumptions.
And that is exactly our mission for you, the listener, in today's deep dive. We are going to completely dismantle and rebuild everything you think you know about haiku and the Japanese relationship with nature.
It is quite the undertaking.
It really is. To do this, we are digging into a fascinating stack of source materials centered around the work of Haruo Shirane. We have his academic curriculum vitae, a detailed book review of his landmark text called Japan and the Culture of the Four Seasons, his essays on comic senryu poetry, and a pivotal paper he wrote titled Beyond the Haiku Moment.
Shirane's perspective is vital here. I mean, he is the Shinsho Professor of Japanese Literature and Culture, and he is the chair of the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at Columbia University.
So he really knows his stuff.
Exactly. He doesn't just study these texts in isolation. He looks at the entire sociological architecture behind them. In his book on the culture of the Four Seasons, he attacks a major sacred cow.
Oh, the affinity myth.
Yes. He argues that the famous Japanese inherent affinity with nature, this idea that harmony with the natural world is some kind of genetic cultural trait, is actually a carefully crafted historical construction.
Okay, let's unpack this because he introduces this concept called secondary nature. And I want to make sure I grasp why they built this. Reading through the sources, I kept thinking about someone living in a massive concrete metropolis today. Curating this pristine, flawless, cottagecore aesthetic on their Instagram feed.
Oh, that is a great way to look at it.
Right, because they are entirely removed from the actual mud, the mosquitoes, the harsh realities of the wilderness, but they use the aesthetic of nature to signal something about their refinement to their followers.
That modern analogy captures the underlying mechanism perfectly. Shirane defines secondary nature as an elegant, highly curated surrogate for wild nature.
So it's not the real woods?
Not at all. You have to remember that the aristocrats writing this early poetry weren't out roughing it in the mountains. They were urban elites, basically confined to the capital.
Just sitting in their courtyards.
Yeah, they cultivated this pristine version of nature in their poetry, their screen paintings, their gardens. It wasn't about ecological conservation at all. It functioned as a sophisticated vocabulary for social communication and, honestly, gatekeeping.
Gatekeeping, like proving you belong in the club.
Yeah, exactly. You proved your cultural worth by knowing exactly which flower corresponded to which specific emotion and which specific season.
So if their version of nature was essentially a curated social tool, like a way to flex on other aristocrats, how did we end up with this rigid modern rulebook?
What do you mean by the modern rule book?
Well, North American haiku magazines are famous for rejecting poems that use metaphor. They demand strict adherence to direct personal experience in the here and now. So if Busan was making up stories about stepping on his living wife's comb, where did our obsession with literal realism come from?
The historical twist here is that the modern obsession with literal realism, the idea that a poem must be a direct sketch from life, was popularized much later.
How much later?
Late 19th century. It stems from a poet named Masaoka Shiki. During Shiki's time, the Meiji period, Japan was rapidly modernizing and aggressively importing Western ideas.
Oh.
So Shiki was actually heavily influenced by Western European notions of realism and individualism.
Wait, really? So the guy who essentially formalized the modern rules of haiku was getting his core philosophy from, like,
Well,
Victorian Europe.
pretty much, yeah. He was trying to elevate haiku to the status of Western literature. And to do that, Shiki promoted a concept called shase,
Should I say?
right, which translates to sketching from life. He actively denounced the traditional, collaborative, and highly imaginative elements of classical Japanese poetry. He wanted unfiltered, objective reality.
Oh, wow.
And the supreme irony is that decades later, early American and British pioneers of English-language haiku read Shiki's modernized, Western-influenced theories and mistakenly believed they were adopting an ancient, mystical Japanese tradition.
That is wild. So what does this all mean? We thought we were tapping into this profound Eastern philosophy, but we've actually just been reflecting our own Western literary realism back at ourselves this whole time.
Yep, we essentially imported our own ideas back under a different label.
We basically cultural appropriated our own ideas. That is hilarious. But, okay, if a classical haiku isn't just a literal snapshot of the present moment, what exactly is the machinery inside the poem? Like, how does it actually work?
Well, this leads us directly to Shirane's core theory, which maps out the secret architecture of these poems. He argues that classical haiku, especially the work of the 17th century master Basho, operates on two intersecting planes.
The horizontal and vertical axis.
Exactly. The horizontal axis represents the present. It encompasses the contemporary world, everyday life, the immediate landscape, and the poet's new personal experiences.
And that horizontal axis seems to be exactly where Western haiku set up camp and never left. You know, the here and now.
Yeah, but by focusing solely on that, you miss the true depth of the art. Basho explicitly taught that relying only on the horizontal axis results in poetry that is fleeting and shallow.
Because it's just a temporary observation that vanishes.
Precisely. To give a poem profound resonance, it requires the vertical axis. This axis represents the past. It is the deep well of history, cultural memory, and an ongoing, deliberate dialogue with ancient texts and dead poets.
I was trying to visualize how these two axes connect, and I thought about it like finding a deeply buried Easter egg in a movie.
Oh, I like that. How so?
Well, you might hear a character use a seemingly simple phrase, and on the surface on the horizontal axis, it makes sense in the scene. But if you know the lore of the franchise, that single phrase carries this massive, unspoken backstory that completely changes the emotional weight of the moment.
That's a really good way to put it.
And in haiku, the trigger for that Easter egg is the season word, right? The kigo.
Yes, the season word is the crucial bridge between the horizontal and the vertical. In classical Japanese poetry, a season word isn't just a meteorological report.
It's not just checking the weather app.
No, not at all. If a poet used the word bush warbler or described a spring rain, they weren't merely noting the weather outside their window. They were invoking a 1,000-year-old pyramid of cultural associations. Generations of poets had already agreed upon the specific emotions, the poetic essences, and the historical locations tied to those words.
So when you drop the word cherry blossom into a poem, you aren't just saying, hey, look at the pretty pink flower.
No, you're doing much more.
You are instantly downloading centuries of poems about the impermanence of life, the fleeting nature of beauty, and maybe even invoking the ghosts of specific ancient poets who famously wrote about them.
What's fascinating here is that you are tapping into a shared cultural dictionary. And Shirane points out that this is the exact structural challenge for English language haiku.
Because we don't have that shared history.
Right. North American season words simply don't trigger a millennium of shared cultural memory. A summer storm in Florida means something entirely different culturally and emotionally than a summer storm in Seattle.
It is so true.
It doesn't instantly connect the reader to a single, unified vertical history the way it did in Edo period Japan.
That makes so much sense. Without that shared vertical axis, aren't Western haikus essentially just skimming the surface? Like completely missing the invisible architecture beneath the poem?
In many ways, yes. They capture the moment but miss the memory.
We've talked about how haiku connects vertically to the dead, pulling all this history into the present. But what about the living? Because if the Zen monk on a mountain is a myth, how are these poems actually being written?
Well, they were written in highly social, deeply interactive environments. Haiku, in its original context, was an intensely social performance.
A performance.
Yeah, the 17-syllable form we know today actually originated as the opening verse called the Haiku of a collaborative, comic-linked poetry game known as Haiku.
A literal party game. Okay, explain how the mechanics of this game actually worked, because honestly, it sounds incredibly stressful to me.
It required immense skill and quick thinking. A group of poets would gather, often at someone's home. An appointed guest of honor would write the 17-syllable opening verse.
Okay, so that's the haiku.
Right. Then another poet would cap it with a 14-syllable verse, but they had to creatively push off the previous imagery to shift the scene and create an entirely new world.
Oh, wow.
Then the next person would add another 17 syllables, shifting the context yet again. And this could go on for dozens, sometimes hundreds of verses.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. It sounds like a hyper-intellectual rap battle. Right. Or maybe a really clever, high-stakes toast at a dinner party. You have to think on your feet, prove you know your vertical axis history, and actively interact with the people sitting right in front of you.
The dinner party toast is a highly accurate comparison. A major recognized function of that opening verse, the haiku, was asatsu.
Waisatsu.
Yes, which translates to greeting or complimenting the host of the gathering.
There is this incredible example in the sources of Basho doing exactly this. He visits a host named Sonome, and he writes this opening verse where he describes gazing intently at white chrysanthemums, noting that there isn't a single speck of dust on them.
And he wasn't praising her gardening skills or her housekeeping.
He wasn't.
No, the dustless white chrysanthemum was a direct, elegant metaphor complimenting Sonome's personal purity and the impeccable, refined state of her home.
But wait, that completely shatters the modern Western rule. We are constantly told haiku cannot use metaphor, yet here is Basho, the undisputed master of the form, directly comparing his host to a flower to flatter her.
It definitely breaks the modern rules.
If this poetry was so social, collaborative, and heavily reliant on metaphor, why do we have this persistent image of the haiku poet as a solitary, literal observer in the woods?
The erasure of that social context happened through the publishing process. Once the social gathering was over, the best individual verses were often stripped of their collaborative context and published in standalone anthologies.
Ah, so they just printed the highlights.
Exactly. Later generations and eventually Western translators read these isolated texts without knowing the circumstances of their creation. The interactive performance was lost to time, leaving only the words on the page.
It is literally like finding the transcript of a brilliant wedding toast centuries later, but all the context is gone. You don't know it was a wedding. You just think this random guy was bizarrely obsessed with talking about raising glasses and describing a couple wearing white and black. You miss the entire point of why the words were spoken.
The original intention just evaporates. And understanding this social, playful origin of haiku leads perfectly into how the form evolved when it finally spread beyond the elite courts and the wealthy merchants.
Right, because it didn't stay locked up with the aristocrats forever. As literacy spread and urbanization took hold in places like Edo, the commoners got a hold of it. And they brought all of their everyday, messy, chaotic lives right into the poetry.
Haiku democratized the elite poetic tradition. As it diffused among the common people, it started incorporating vernacular, everyday topics that the ancient Kyoto aristocrats would have considered horribly unrefined.
Like what?
Well, they weren't just writing about elegant cherry blossoms and the harvest moon anymore. They were writing about dandelions, the smell of garlic, and a rather visceral season word they called cat's love.
Cat's love.
Yeah, which referred to the loud, obnoxious squealing of mating cats in the spring alleyways.
I absolutely love that detail.
Yeah.
Cat's love as a recognized season word. It is so chaotic and so undeniably real. It is the exact opposite of that pristine secondary nature we talked about earlier. And this embrace of the messy human experience birthed a completely new form, didn't it?
It birthed senri. This was a 17-syllable comic poetry form that evolved directly out of the Haiku game. But Senryu did something radical. It eventually ditched the rigid season words entirely.
Oh, they just got rid of them.
Yeah, it abandoned the vertical axis of classical nature and focused entirely on the horizontal axis to satirize the reality of the human condition.
The examples of Senryu in the sources are genuinely hilarious, and they feel so incredibly modern. There is one from Karai Senryu's Willow Barrel collections about a samurai who is standing guard, but he is so incredibly bored at his post that he just sits there, intensely focused, counting the hairs in his lord's nostrils.
It is a brilliant, subtle deflation of rigid social authority. It strips the samurai of his mythical warrior status and reduces him to a bored employee.
And there was another one about a doctor who knows his patient is likely going to die, so he starts prepping an excuse ahead of time. He tells the family, oh, just prepare for a sudden change for the worse, purely to cover his own tracks when things go south.
It's extremely relatable.
It really is. It makes me wonder, though, by enforcing these solemn, rigid, nature-only rules on haiku today, are we actually suffocating the democratic, playful spirit that made the poetry so beloved by the Japanese public in the first place?
Shirane makes a compelling argument that we are. He notes that modern urban haiku, poems written today about riding the subway, commuter traffic, or sitting in movie theaters are actually keeping the true original spirit of haikai alive far better than purists who insist on writing exclusively about frogs and rural ponds.
Because the original poets were writing about their actual horizontal reality. For the commoners playing these games, their reality wasn't a pristine mountain peak. It was the bustling, loud, crowded city of Edo.
Precisely. They were actively engaging with their immediate environment in their community. Shirane's work ultimately teaches us how to look at any art form critically. It reminds us that context is everything. What seems to a modern reader like a simple, isolated moment in a haiku is, in reality, a complex intersection of social performance, deep historical memory, and heavily constructed aesthetics.
It really makes you rethink how we categorize the art and media we consume. You can apply this framework to almost anything today. When you look at a piece of art or a film or even a viral social media post, is it just a horizontal snapshot of right now? Or is it pulling from a deep, vertical well of cultural memory?
Right. And when we strip away the context, we almost always project our own modern values onto the past, just like Western poets projected their desire for unfiltered realism onto masters like Basho and Besson.
We constantly recreate history in our own image if we aren't careful to look for the structural axes that actually built it. Which brings us to one final mind-bending nugget from the sources to leave you with, something we haven't even touched on yet.
Oh, the gendered elements.
Yes. When you go all the way back to the earliest foundational Japanese poetry collections, like the Menyoshu and the Kokinshu, the seasons and the elements of nature were actually strictly gendered.
It completely reframes how we understand their interaction with the landscape. The natural world was not an objective backdrop. It was deeply psychological.
Exactly. The texts reveal that flowers and trees were deliberately coded as female, while animals and birds, like the wandering deer or the singing bush warbler, were coded as male.
It was a very deliberate choice.
So when an ancient poet wrote a seemingly innocent verse about a stag wandering through a field of bush clover, it wasn't just a nature documentary scene. It was a direct, heavily coded mirror for the courtship and mating rituals of the aristocracy. The landscape itself was a literal map of human desire.
It proves once again that for these poets, nature was never just nature. It was always a vocabulary for the human experience.
It changes everything. The next time you look through a window or point a camera or even scroll through an Instagram feed, ask yourself, what is the vertical axis here? What deep unseen history is hiding just outside the frame? Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.